Some women ruffled each other's hair looking for lice and nits. We hugged each other to keep warm. One always remembers the moment when someone wraps you in her arms. Maybe that's why more women survived, because meanwhile, men were dying like flies. The men also made friends among themselves, but it was different. There was more female solidarity than male. They were not willing to sacrifice anything for the other. That was the main difference between them and us. These are the words of a Holocaust survivor, who remembers the experience of living in a concentration camp and what it was like to seek the company of other prisoners to cope with the pain. The extermination centers did not distinguish by sex, and for all those who were locked up inside, life was hell. However, the testimonies indicate that the female population encountered extra torment, as they were the targets of the Nazis' sexual violence. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes we will tell you everything about the suffering of women in the concentration camps. To understand this story, we must first understand what the Holocaust was. Between 1941 and 1945, the Third Reich and its collaborators carried out a systematic plan to exterminate the Jewish population. At present, specialists estimate that the number of victims reached 6 million, which represented 2/3 of the total number of Jews living in Europe. Of this total, 2 million were women. Once they entered a concentration camp, they were subjected to the same mistreatment and abuse that men experienced. They were constantly beaten, humiliated, starved, and used as slave labor. Added to this, they were subjected to different forms of sexual and gender violence. When a woman walked through the gates of a concentration camp, she would have a code tattooed on her arm to identify her. Next, the hair on her head and even her pubic hair were shaved off. Admission culminated in a degrading body inspection, which included a vaginal examination by a Nazi doctor. In this way, a tortuous process of dehumanization began, which aimed to strip the Jewish women of their feminine identity and turn them into empty shells, shadows of what they were, subjected to obey without hesitation. Despite the fact that National Socialist legislation prevented Aryans from having sexual relations with women of the supposedly inferior races, in practice this regulation was not complied with. The most blatant example was in Eastern Europe, where 80% of SS men were found guilty of raping female Jewish prisoners in the camps. In some cases, an entire posse abused a defenseless woman until she was left bleeding on the ground. Some prison guards had the disturbing habit of standing in the middle of the corridor that led to the gas chamber, and touching the private parts of the women who were being led to death. With their actions, the Nazis sought to destroy the minds of their victims, and in the case of women, they knew that the most effective method was sexual humiliation. One Holocaust survivor remembers it this way: Jews were forced to scrub the floor in their underwear, and then made to clean the toilets and eat what was inside the latrines. Their heads were plunged into toilets and then they were forced to walk around the field with their faces covered in excrement, with no chance to wash, while the guards yelled insults at them like "dirty Jew." This kind of harassment brought serious consequences to the body of the victims. By the end of World War II, the reproductive capacity of many survivors had completely deteriorated. On the other hand, the frequency of rapes increased the possibility of pregnancy, and many Jews became mothers in the concentration camps. This added a new concern to the already terrible lives of these women, who now had to worry about the fate of these children as well. The sadism of the Nazis did not spare even infants, who at any moment could die horribly. The following testimony from a survivor illustrates this perfectly. SS members amused themselves by beating pregnant women with sticks and whips, throwing hungry dogs at them to tear them to pieces, or dragging them along the ground and kicking them. Sometimes when they collapsed from pain and passed out, they were thrown into cremation ovens while they were still alive. Living conditions in a concentration camp were desperate. Women were forced to work producing material for the Nazi war industry in slave-like conditions. They weren't even allowed to take a bathroom break, so many were forced to urinate on themselves. The diet consisted of small portions of poorly prepared broth that barely kept hunger away. Sometimes, when Germany was victorious in battle, the Nazi officers would allow the prisoners to eat a small piece of meat or bread along with their daily soup. However, this did not happen often, and food was so scarce that many women had to resort to selling their bodies for rations. Exchanging sexual favors with SS guards became routine, as for many Jewish women this was the only way to survive. A survivor remembers it in these words: "At first, I was deeply disturbed by these types of practices. My pride and sense of integrity made it seem disgusting to me. But later, I saw that with the bread they gave me as a form of payment, I could feed the most hungry and save their lives." Another girl, thanks to prostitution, was saved from going to the gas chamber. Because of these situations, I began to understand why we were doing this, and I forgave us. The Nazis also made use of the sex trade and legalized it within the concentration camps. The officers believed that it would serve as an incentive for both male guards and prisoners to be more productive in their tasks. The brothels were barracks separated from the rest by barbed wire, inside which there were approximately 20 women forced to have sexual relations with the clients. Most had been brought from Ravensbruck, the all-female camp. Those who wanted to contract their services had to pay a small sum of money and undergo a medical examination to make sure they did not have diseases. Once passed, they were allowed 20 minutes alone with a woman. However, the truth is that intimacy was illusory, since the sexual act was supervised by guards who watched the client through holes in the wall. The slaves were recruited from among the prisoners in the camp by the SS, who promised them that if they joined the brothels, they would have access to a better standard of living. This included a personal room, soap, food in good conditions, or a reduction in prison sentence. This sometimes provoked the anger of other inmates, who saw the slaves as collaborators with Nazism. One of them recalls the following situation: "One day we saw a woman who agreed to work as an SS prostitute. We caught her and beat her so brutally that she could barely move. I never knew if she recovered or not, but our fury was so much that we had to punish her this way." As we can see, life in a camp was brutal, and the women went through a true hell inside. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think was the most terrible thing about the lives of women in the concentration camps? The emancipation of women is only something invented by the Jewish intellect, and its content is permeated by the same spirit. The woman does not need to emancipate herself from the true and most important moments of German life. This shocking phrase was pronounced by Adolf Hitler shortly after having seized power in Germany. With these words, the Nazi leader left little doubt about what the role of women in the Third Reich should be. The National Socialist movement came to completely revolutionize German society. After 1933, nothing would be the same as before. A new era was beginning in Germany, and it would be marked by brutality, sadism, and complete lack of mercy. The female population was no stranger to this reality. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you how women lived in Nazi Germany. Let's get started. In the years preceding Hitler's rise to power, German women had experienced an improvement in their situation. Since 1919, their political rights were extended. They were granted the right to vote and hold public office in the government. On the other hand, one of the consequences of the First World War was the lack of men. Hundreds of thousands had died on the battlefront or been disabled, either from mutilation or psychological trauma. The shortage of male workers in post-war Germany was resolved by employing women. In this way, a good part of the female population began to occupy prominent positions in factories and offices, something unthinkable until then. In those days, the Weimar Republic was experiencing an incipient female emancipation. Everyone was aware that gender roles were changing and that the place of women was not only taking care of the house and children, but that they could aspire to much more. However, there were those who viewed these developments in a bad light, believing that it was all part of a plot to undermine Germany, and calling for these advances to be reversed. The National Socialist Party was among the detractors of women's emancipation. One of their mottos was Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, an old expression that means children, church, kitchen. The Nazis never made any secret of their views on what the role of women should be, and once Hitler came to power, he immediately took it upon himself to make these ideals a reality. In 1933, he prohibited the female population from participating in the leadership of the party or its administration, which in practice was equivalent to expelling them from politics forever. The Führer justified his decision as follows: "The fact that we have removed women from public life is due solely to our desire to restore their essential dignity. It is not that we do not respect women, but that we respect them too much enough to keep them in touch with the miseries of parliamentary democracy." On the other hand, school regulations were modified to discourage young students from studying for a university degree. Although it may seem surprising, many women were in favor of these measures, and supported a return to traditional gender roles. In the Third Reich, the ideal woman was one who stayed in her house, obeyed her husband, and lived to raise her children. The Nazis promoted motherhood as an essential trait of the feminine, claiming that the birth rate in Germany was low and that more children were needed. Yet despite all this preaching, there were several Nazi women who inadvertently defied these precepts. An exemplary case was that of Leni Riefenstahl, who, far from living for domestic chores, came to be in charge of shooting the official films of the dictatorship. The Nazis created their own women's associations, with the aim of indoctrinating their members from their earliest childhood and turning them into Hitler fanatics. In this sense, the most important organization was the League of German Girls, thought of as the female branch of the Hitler Youth. In 1936, membership in it became compulsory for all girls between the ages of 10 and 18. There were a series of requirements to belong to the League, such as being of German origin and not having a Jewish background. The members carried out recreational activities such as theater, singing, community tasks, and crafts. They were allowed to go camping without the presence of their parents. They made camps, games, and hikes in the mountains. This association was strongly criticized by the most conservative sectors of Nazism, who nicknamed it the League of German Mattresses, suggesting that its members were sexually promiscuous. In fact, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, was one of his strongest opponents, once saying the following: "When I see these girls marching around with their backpacks singing, it's enough to make me sick." Himmler promoted the creation of bridal schools, academies where all those who wanted to marry an SS officer had to attend. In these establishments, women had to take a mandatory 6-week course in which they were taught how to properly run a home. They were taught to iron, clean, sew, take care of children and cook, so that they would be the ideal wife according to Nazism. On the other hand, they were told that they were the pillar of the German race, the ones in charge of maintaining blood purity, and they were given classes in genetics and eugenics. At the end of the course, they received a diploma certifying their knowledge and authorizing them to marry. With the outbreak of World War II, the female prototype of Nazism underwent several modifications. The ideal woman was no longer simply the one who took care of the housework, but the one who, from her place, helped with the war effort. The League of German Girls ran charity drives and collected money donations to send to soldiers fighting on the front lines. Musical choirs were also formed to cheer up the wounded in military hospitals. The young adults were recruited as auxiliaries to the armed forces, serving as anti-aircraft system assistants, searchlight operators, and communications personnel, as well as nurses. Although they were not classified as soldiers, they were subject to the code of military discipline, and even had to take an oath of allegiance to Hitler and the commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. On the other hand, just as in the days of the First World War, the German government once again found itself with the same problem. Hundreds of thousands of men perished fighting the Allies, or were disabled from wounds received, so that German industries had no workers. The leaders of the Third Reich had spent years saying that the natural place for women was the home, but now they had to encourage the opposite, that is, that they be employed in factories and offices to meet the demand for labor. Otherwise, the German army could be left undersupplied and without provisions. It is estimated that in 1945, in the last phase of the war, 85% of administrative, laboratory and accounting positions were held by women. In a certain sense, as we see, it can be said that Hitler's initial vision for the female population failed, since the needs of the war ended up imposing themselves. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, why do you think so many women supported Nazism? It is impossible for me to imagine, dear daughter, that I will never see you again, that I will never be able to hug you again. I would like the opportunity, even for the last time, to caress you and comb your hair. I say goodbye to you, and I promise that until the last moment of my life I will give you reasons to be proud of me. These words belong to Olga Benario, a woman who was a prisoner in the Ravensbruck concentration camp. While she was locked up, she wrote a farewell letter to her daughter, as she knew that sooner or later death would arrive. Life inside this site was short and cruel, in large part because of the chilling tortures administered by Nazi guards. Do not move from your screen, because in the next few minutes we'll tell you everything about the punishment of the prisoners in the Ravensbruck camp. But before we continue, we are very happy to tell you that this video is sponsored by Aura, an incredible tool that will help you protect all your data on the internet. It is not news that all our information is available to anyone on the internet, and that happens because there are brokers that are in charge of compiling all your information and selling it to other companies or people who request it to offer you something, spam you, or for even worse reasons. Aura will identify these brokers and remove all your private information. It will even remove you from spam and robocall lists. Aura also monitors your emails and passwords to see if they were involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web, and gives you recommendations on what to do. Plus, it has a VPN, password manager, credit monitoring, and just about every internet security tool you'll ever need, all in one app. You can register using my code, aura.com/militaryhistory, or by scanning the QR on the screen, and try the application for 2 weeks, completely free of charge. Check how many brokers share your information and don't wait any longer to protect it. You can thank me later. I'll leave the links for you in the description and in the comments. Ravensbruck was a German concentration camp reserved exclusively for women. It operated between 1939 and 1945 in the north of the country, just 90 kilometers from Berlin. It is estimated that during the time that its doors remained open, about 132,000 prisoners passed through this site. All of them went through a hellish experience that began from the moment they were admitted. The first thing that was done was to strip the inmates of their personal possessions, so that their clothes and valuables were confiscated. Next, a number was tattooed on their arm with which they were identified by the authorities of the site. This was just the beginning of a lurid process of dehumanization designed to break the minds and will of the victims. Before being assigned a barracks to live in, the women had to undergo a rigorous inspection by a doctor. This functioned as a first form of torture, since the prisoners' genitals were manipulated without their consent. On the other hand, their mouths were inspected to see if they had any gold teeth. If this were the case, the doctor wrote it down on a form so that later, once the inmate was killed in the gas chamber or died of exhaustion, the tooth would be pulled from her corpse. At Ravensbruck, female inmates had to submit to a strict disciplinary code, which stipulated penalties for acts of insubordination and disrespect to guards. This, added to the arbitrariness of the top brass of the field, made the punishments something habitual, one more part of the infernal routine of this place. Over time, the prisoners began to identify when they would be subjected to torture. When they were summoned to the central courtyard of Ravensbruck, they would panic, since this was the beginning of a long session of suffering. Take, for example, the testimony of Francine Bryant, a survivor who remembers it this way: "There was no fixed time to call us, sometimes it was daytime and sometimes it was night. They forced us to leave our barracks and stand in the yard for hours. For reasons we couldn't understand, we weren't allowed to walk or move a single muscle. Usually this happened on Sunday afternoons and holidays, as those were the times when the kitchen was closed. We were not fed and we were exhausted." Some inmates remember that they had to remain on their feet for 7 hours, from 3 in the afternoon to 10 at night. This punishment was particularly cruel in winter and summer. when temperatures could cause a woman to succumb to hypothermia or faint from the heat. When this happened, they were kicked to the ground or savagely beaten by the guards, who were on the lookout, walking among the inmates in a threatening manner, attentive to who did not comply with the punishment guidelines. These group torture sessions were organized when a prisoner accidentally broke a window or inadvertently caused minor material damage to the facilities. In this way, in the event of a mistake by just one, all her companions in the barracks had to take responsibility. The inmates' uniforms were black and white, although due to the impossibility of cleaning themselves, and due to frequent corporal punishment, their clothes were gray and red. The vast majority of the inmates had scars, bruises, and poorly healed wounds. The way to punish disrespect, such as not greeting a guard or not showing up for daily checkups, was through strenuous physical exercise. The women were forced to remove their trousers and squat, standing on their fingertips with their arms stretched out in front of them. A guard would yell at them every couple of seconds to stand up properly, then order them to return to their previous position. This sequence could be repeated for an hour or two, until the women were exhausted with numb arms and legs. One of the favorite punishments of the SS consisted of posting a score of men at a gate. Every time a group of female prisoners had to walk around, the guards beat them in the back with batons, to the point where many of them ended up with broken bones. During the night, the women returned to their barracks after a grueling day of forced labor and cruel punishment. However, even at that moment they could not rest, since they had to share the beds of 3 or 4, which made it impossible to sleep comfortably. Thus, not only did their bodies fall apart from the beatings, but they also woke up with contractures and exhausted muscles. The harshest punishment at the Ravensbruck concentration camp was reserved for the worst acts of indiscipline, such as assaulting guards or attempting to escape. Although in theory it was used as a sanction and a way to rehabilitate a rebel prisoner, in practice it functioned as a death sentence due to its extreme level of violence. The woman was to remove her pants and then stand still while she received 25 blows to her bare buttocks from a stick. Many times, the instrument had a rubber tip to make the pain even worse. The prisoner screamed as the blows tore at her flesh and a torrent of blood poured down her legs, pooling around her. At these sessions, there was always an SS doctor present, whose task it was to monitor the woman's heart rate. If her heart was racing too fast and she looked like she was going to have a heart attack, the beating had to stop, so she wouldn't die immediately. This did not mean that the woman escaped the penalty, but simply that the torture resumed the next day, when her pulse was already in order. The punishment ended once the 25 lashes were completed. Usually, the recluse died from blood loss, although she sometimes survived for a few more weeks. In these cases, her wound, which was never properly treated, became infected and caused fatal septicemia. As we see, it is clear that the Ravensbruck camp was one of the most abominable places of the Third Reich. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, what do you think was the wildest punishment in Ravensbruck? Leave us your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.